Good afternoon and welcome to this Centre for Public Policy webinar. This is the first of our election series webinars brought to you by the University of Glasgow, the Centre for Public Policy and the Campaign for Social Sciences. My name's Kezia Dugdale and I'm going to be your host for this afternoon. I am the Associate Director at the Centre for Public Policy, and we exist to be the place where evidence meets practice, and our job is to foster collaboration between the research community and the policy community by sharing evidence, nurturing skills, creating space for fresh thinking and hoping to prepare the next generation of policymakers. And we do that in a number of different ways, by producing our own research and analysis and amplifying the research and analysis of others here at the University of Glasgow. We also have a leading podcast called Spotlight, which we'll share more details of with you in a second or two. And we're also doing our very best to be a connecting force between the policy practitioners and research expertise. So that takes us to the 2026 local elections taking place across the United Kingdom. I'm going to say more about that in a second or two, but the first thing I was hoping to do was to introduce our colleague from the Campaign for Social Science, Ed Bridges. Welcome to the webinar.
Hi, Kez. Can you hear me? Yes.
We can.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really pleased to be part of this. It's a privilege for us to be partnering with the Centre for Public Policy on this webinar. For those of you who don't know, the Campaign for Social Science is part of the Academy for Social Sciences. We exist to demonstrate how social science research, such as the bits we'll be hearing about this afternoon, improves public policy, society and all of our lives. And over the course of this year, we're running a hub on devolution on the Campaign for Social Science website. So if you Google Campaign for Social Science Devolution Hub, you will find it, featuring written articles, as well as webinar recordings and recordings of some live events exploring different elements of devolution across the UK. We had a really good webinar last week looking at how the 4 UK nations have approached health policy. We're part of one next week looking at 4 nations' different approaches to poverty, and we've drawn really well actually on experience from within Glasgow University. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this, and yeah, thank you for inviting us.
Thanks, Ed. We really appreciate working with you. So just a bit more on what our plans are at the Centre for Public Policy for the election. We've got a fun slide to show you about what you can enjoy over the coming weeks. We're halfway through those local elections, but we have 4 webinars in total, of which this is the first. I'll introduce more about the detail of today's in a second or two, but there's also a chance to join us next week in conversation with the Institute for Fiscal Studies to look at the party's plans on tax and spending in the economy. And also later next week, we have a session with Ipsos, looking not just at what the polls are saying, but what's driving voters' intentions behind how they're going to cast their votes in May. So we also have lots of written content for you to digest at your leisure, which you can find on our website. If you scan that QR code on the right of your screen, that'll take you to our election pages at the Centre for Public Policy, where you can find a variety of different policy insights and blogs. So please do take a look, sign up for the future webinars and have a read of the policy insights and blogs that we've got available for you there. We also have a special series of Spotlight, our University of Glasgow podcast, which is very much focused on the elections. We've got 4 episodes of that published so far. The latest one just went up yesterday, looking at the detail of all of the manifestoes from the 6 political parties in Scotland currently projected to achieve seats in the Holyrood elections in May. So have a listen to that, and you can subscribe to that podcast if you're not already, and you'll be kept up to date with even more developments from the campaign. That takes us to the focus of today's webinar, which is exclusively on the issue of the extent to which devolved governments can address the cost of living crisis. We know that cost of living crisis is consistently the highest issue of consideration or importance to voters across the United Kingdom, in Scotland and in Wales specifically. We'll hear more about the details of that in a second. But to what extent can devolved governments address it? What's the limit of the powers that they have? Are those powers enough? And are they using them to the best of possible abilities with the greatest effect? To discuss that and more, we've got 2 leading experts from across the United Kingdom who are going to present to you. for about 10 minutes and then take your questions. So please make sure that you put forward your ideas and questions either in the chat bar on YouTube or directly to the team here at the Centre for Public Policy, and they'll come through to me. So first of all, today we're going to have Professor Nicola McEwen, who's the Professor of Public Policy and Governance here at the University of Glasgow and also the Director of the Centre for Public Policy. And after Nicola, we'll hear from Heaven Gwilym from Bangor University in Wales, who's a senior lecturer in policy studies and also has vast experience around issues of poverty and welfare. But first up, Nicola, can you lead us off with the extent to which Scotland can influence cost of living crisis?
Thanks, Kez. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Grand. So, I think before I get into the specifics of that, I think we'd want to point out, I suppose, the obvious in that the election is taking place against a backdrop of global insecurity, where we have had 2 decades of really sluggish growth at best, where we're seeing very little growth in wages. We saw a fall in the living standards over the last Parliament. So this is the backdrop of really quite significant structural challenges that will face the next administration. On top of that, we have the cost of living pressures that are the urgent and hopefully short-term shocks that are a consequence of a lot of the international developments over which Scotland and even the UK has very little control. And we may not have seen, excuse me, the worst effects of those yet in terms of inflationary pressures, all of which bites in Scotland, in Wales, in the rest of the UK, and interacts with those areas of responsibility that fall with the devolved legislatures and governments. Next slide, please. So as Kez said, the cost of living crisis has been recognised across the political spectrum as being one of the most important issues of this election campaign, consistently among the top 3. And that was even before. So this is from the Ashcroft poll from March. So that's even before we started to see some of the particularly challenging effects emerging from the war in Iran. And you see that as a pattern across all of the political parties. So the parties can't help but take that on board, and we have seen them within the manifestoes try to come up with some ideas within the areas of devolved competence. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All of the political parties cling to the aspiration of economic growth. It was also the central mission of the UK Labour government when they entered office. Economic growth is a relatively easy thing to wish for. It's a much harder thing to deliver for any government. For the devolved governments in particular, they have quite limited economic levers at their disposal. They have some, but they are limited, and they have no control over employment law, for example, or minimum wage law. They do have control over some of the things that can help to drive economic growth, but these would be things like skills, education, the kinds of tools that might help to drive the economy in the longer term, but are ultimately of limited use to the here and now, to the current pressures of the cost of living crisis here and now. All of the manifestos will say something around tax, because there are significant tax levers in the Scottish Parliament, much more so than in the Senedd. And Scotland already has, since the devolution of income tax bans and thresholds and rates and so on, already has now quite a significantly different and distinctive income tax system than in the rest of the UK, that is more progressive but does pinch in the middle more so than tax systems elsewhere. Some of the parties are calling for tax cuts. Some of the parties are calling for more redistribution. Some of the parties are suggesting stability. Those suggestions are largely born from their ideological preferences around tax and tax redistribution. Council tax reform is well, I was going to say it's on the agenda, but it's not really on the agenda. Again, it's aspirational. So all of the parties have agreed that council tax in its current formation is inadequate and almost certainly regressive. And there are some suggestions in there to try to address that and to try to reform the system through consensus. A big question mark over how much we will be able to do things by consensus after the next election. Again, distinctive for the Scottish Parliament compared to the Senedd is that the government does have some social security levers, particularly for families with children, with the Scottish Child Payment, and the SNP, as the Scottish Government had already committed to the pledge that's in the manifesto of increasing the Scottish Child Payment for families that are struggling in particular. For other political parties concerned about the growing cost of social security and the pressures that places on the devolved budget, are calling for more restrictions on the basis that they believe that will reduce economic inactivity. And there are a whole variety of commitments around public service support, whether from expanded childcare to supporting public transport, fair funding for local government, a whole host of other areas. But there is a limit to what the devolved governments can do in this space, not a constitutional limit, but a fiscal one. And if you can see from the charts at the side there, these were the forecasts produced by the Scottish Fiscal Commission that is tasked with forecasting revenue and spending commitments. And you can see that over the course of the next Parliament, the resources budget, that's the budget for day-to-day spend in the Scottish Government, is forecast to increase by the most marginal of degrees, making it very difficult to spend additional things, because remember, half of the Scottish Government's budget goes on payroll, and the pay pressures in the context of inflation, higher inflation, will be really very stark and really very significant. The chart at the bottom indicates that there will be a real terms decline in capital spending over the course of the next Parliament too. So the next government, whoever it is, whatever its makeup, is going to face a very difficult fiscal settlement, and cannot avoid having to make hard choices over where its priorities lie. That might be why we are seeing the emergence of market interventions. So things that may not necessarily cost the Scottish Government money, resource to invest in, but are attempts to regulate the market to limit the prices and the costs charged to the public as customers or as service users. We've seen calls for rent controls by some parties, experimented, of course, in the last Parliament, calls for price caps to public transport, to buses in particular, and most notably, and next slide, please, calls in the surprise call in the SNP manifesto for food price caps. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on this particular policy because it was new. It took us by surprise. There hadn't been, to the best of my knowledge, previous discussion or consideration of having food price caps to control the price of essential goods, essential foods, essentially. So the policy in the box here is defended as a public health intervention to establish a statutory price ceiling, so a price cap on an essential basket of 20 to 50 food items on sale in large supermarkets. So what that would require, were it to be introduced, is that supermarkets would identify within a category, let's say the category was bread, at least one brand, one type of that foodstuff that would be sold at or below the statutory cap as set out in the legislation. That's a very new policy for Scotland, indeed for the UK, but it's not unfamiliar to other European countries. It seems to me to be very similar to a policy that has been in place and up and running for a few years in Croatia. And various other European countries have, whether through legislation or in the French case, temporarily through negotiation, sought to limit the price of essential items as a way not to promote public health, but as a way to combat inflationary pressures. So can it be done in Scotland? It's been very controversial, and most of the speculation has been that it can't be done, that it would be blocked, that it would be blocked by the UK Internal Market Act. And there's been an awful lot of misunderstanding about that and about what the Internal Market Act does and does not do. And there'd be a number of different tests that would have to be passed and met if this particular policy was to be implemented. The first would be, is it within devolved competence at all? And here we're not talking about the Internal Market Act. We're talking about probably reservations around consumer protection. So the Lord Advocate would have to be confident that the draft bill would be within devolved competence before it came before Parliament. Then, then there are the internal market considerations, and its core principles are a mutual recognition and non-discrimination. My hunch is that it would be the non-discrimination element of the Internal Market Act which would come into play here. And really, this is designed, there's nothing in the Internal Market Act that stops the Scottish Parliament legislating in ways that would intervene in the market locally. What it does do is stop it from doing so in a way that disadvantages any traders, any businesses that are bringing their goods, bringing their products, bringing their services into Scotland. And those might be effects that are direct, or it might be effects that are indirect, and indirect discrimination, which in some narrow grounds can be justified where it's seen as reasonable and reasonably be considered as a necessary means of achieving a legitimate aim. The legitimate aim in this case, defined in law, would be about the protection of human health. For me, I think the health link is perhaps tenuous in this case and maybe difficult to get over that hurdle. So that would leave the Scottish Government needing to find an agreement with the other governments of the UK to secure what's called a common framework agreement to opt out, to be excluded, have this piece of legislation excluded from the terms of the United Kingdom Internal Market Act. And post 2024 election, post the review that the UK government did, a consideration will be given to public health grounds when those exemption exclusion requests are being considered. And that comes to the final point. If the UK government, which would probably be the barrier, were to refuse to exclude, would that refusal lead to yet another constitutional stooshy? And the speculation being that this is really the purpose of this manifesto pledge all along. I don't know whether that is the purpose. What I do know is that as a policy measure to help alleviate the challenges that people are facing through the cost of living pressures. This is not a quick fix, if it is indeed a fix at all, because it would take time, it would be prolonged negotiation, prolonged consultation, and even if it were to create a constitutional stooshy and be blocked, I don't think the constitutional repercussions would be all that significant in any case. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Looking at the reality that it's maybe not the limits of devolution which are the issue here, it's the limits of the hard cash, and we'll get into the detail of that in a second or two after we've had the perspective from Wales. So welcome to the webinar, Heaven Gwilym from the University of Bangor. I'd be delighted to hear your perspective.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Prynhawn Da. We have a very exciting election here in Wales because we could see a change of government. We have a neck-and-neck race really between Plaid Cymru and Reform. I mean, it's too close to call the results of the election. They're both on roughly around 27% pointage, with Labour behind at somewhere around, well, below 20%. And according to YouGov, the people who are satisfied with Welsh Labour government is as low as 13%, which largely explains perhaps why we are likely to see a change possibly in the election. So we can have the next slide, please. As you can see, the cost of living crisis is of huge importance in the Welsh election. Most of the people who think it's the top issue stating, roughly about 51%, with health coming close. And that's a reflection of the severity of the cost of living crisis that we are experiencing. Roughly about 50% of the people of Wales say that they're experiencing difficulties in buying, basic items, issues around affording heating, rent, etc. This is kind of widespread, this feeling that it's actually got worse in recent times. And according to YouGov, most of the Welsh electorate believe that the cost of living crisis is going to get worse next year, and that their family finances are going to get worse as well. So huge challenges. Also very interestingly, from the perspective of the opinion polls, YouGov also says that no political party in Wales has a firm lead on how best to handle the cost of living crisis, which kind of indicates that the party who can persuade the electorate that they do have the solutions to the cost of living crisis will have a lead and perhaps win be the largest party, at least in Wales. The likelihood in Wales, of course, is going to be, and I think it's different to Scotland, where the SNP are predicted to win outright. In Wales, it's very, very likely, probable that there will be a coalition government, and it's a question about who actually would form that coalition government. Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party, is slightly in the lead. They're likely perhaps to be the largest party and form the government. However, there is no clear lead for any of the political parties on how to deal with the cost of living crisis, and the leadership of the political parties, no leader is actually standing out as extremely popular in Wales. So it's a very contested race in Wales, as you can see. Although the cost of living crisis is at the top of the election in Wales, there are other areas which are contesting as well, not least health, but also more recently on the scene is defence, and perhaps that's reflecting, the situation internationally. So we can move on to the next slide. I just put this slide in because this is from NatSen. This is UK-wide. I remember seeing a webinar by John Curtis recently pointing out, that the public opinion hadn't changed in terms of wanting higher taxation for public services. And that remained high even through that era that we've had of high public expenditure through COVID and the cost of living crisis, and following the election of the Labour government in Westminster in 24. However, although I haven't heard Sir John Curtis speak on this recently, but as you can see from this graph, there is now clear indication that people are feeling that the level of taxation has reached its peak, and the support, therefore, for tax cuts is actually showing an increase, and the popularity of increasing further taxation is actually on the way down. That won't be a surprise, because that's what happens when governments are elected with the promise of higher public expenditure, better public services. After a while, maybe a year or two, public opinion changes against that, and they want tax cuts again. And that seems to be happening. That may also reflect the cost of living crisis as well, of course, because some parties on the right of the political spectrum tend to address the cost of living crisis by suggesting tax cuts, particularly income tax cuts, to give people more money in their pockets, as it were. And that's reflected in the Welsh general election, as it were. So if you have the next slide. Already, of course, like in Scotland, Welsh government does have a lot that it can actually do to address the cost of living crisis. Primarily, and very importantly, it has a lot of possibilities for giving advice to people, because it sees this as really, really important, and it's quite clear why, because benefits and social security and what you can claim, what you're entitled to, particularly when we have so many means-tested benefits. Most benefits are now means-tested, and we have a lack of universal benefits. Citizens' advice and other organisations are extremely important to give people the advice that they need. So that's already in place. But Welsh Government also has other things, which has actually introduced over decades. For example, free bus passes for the over 60s, free prescriptions for medication in Wales, free parking in hospitals and that kind of thing. And more recently, free bus travel for young people. So there's already a lot of policies, social policies, that Wales has, as well as, of course, more recently, it has helped people, particularly in rural areas in Wales, because rural areas in Wales are more dependent on oil for heating, overrepresented when compared to the rest of the UK. And so Welsh Government has provided some extra funds for people in Wales to be able to afford to refill their oil tanks in their gardens. And also, of course, there is the Discretionary Assistance Fund and discretionary housing payments, which are basically emergency payments, particularly when the cost of living crisis has peaked as a result of the recent war in Iran, and just to try and help people to actually manage their budgets in those very difficult times. So, and in other areas, of course, council tax, Welsh Government is reforming council tax. Council tax is unfair, and the Welsh Government will be introducing a lower tier for people on lower income, and therefore that means that council tax for some groups will reduce. But there are, of course, several exemptions to council tax if you're living on your own, if you're on universal credit, etc. As you all know, the social security framework is so complex, it's extremely difficult to understand, hence the importance of advice that's offered through Citizens' Advice and other organisations. And other areas that Wales tries to help with food, for example, Welsh Government actually subsidises to quite a significant degree food banks in Wales, giving them financial support to buy food, to store food, because of the increasing demand, of course, on food banks at this particular time. And then resilience is another issue in terms of helping people. Wales has a strategy for resilience that encompasses mental health and well-being, as well as trying to develop community support and community development. And in housing, Welsh Government has banned, of course, the right to buy, but still we have an enormous housing crisis. Welsh Government has targeted to build 20,000 social housing during this Senedd, but it has failed to do so. It's missed that target quite significantly. I think it's built somewhere around 16 council houses in the last few years. That's a reflection, of course, of the huge challenge that the Labour government of Westminster has set itself of building. I think it's 200,000 houses a year or even more, and it's not possible, for various reasons. For example, labour, skills, not enough concrete, all the kinds of reasons why. Planning is another issue, of course, why they haven't been able to achieve that particular goal. But there are ways forward, I guess, trying to look ahead, and some of those areas might be in tackling some of the inequalities, particularly poverty, child poverty in Wales. There is a child poverty strategy. One of the political parties is suggesting something similar to Scotland, a child payment, but it would be set at a very low rate of just £10 a week. And I think it would be piloted. So, that tackling poverty, addressing those issues is a priority. And we see in the manifestos from the left-leaning parties, their emphasis tends to be on more help and as was said earlier, putting some regulations in place to restrict the rising prices, trying to keep, bus fares, for example, free, extending the free extending free childcare. That's very much within the manifesto. So most of the political parties, actually, some offering more generous childcare than others, but childcare obviously is central to addressing the issue of poverty and addressing the issue of the cost of living crisis in Wales. And the left-leaning parties are promising childcare from 9 months old upwards, and other initiatives will be extending free school meals to secondary schools, for example. So those are some of the ideas. And we see that the right-leaning parties tend to have a different emphasis. They put the emphasis more on cutting taxation and giving money in people's pockets. So, for example, the Conservative Party and the Reform Party are saying similar things. And also reform the business rates, particularly for small businesses and for shops in the high street. So those are the kind of measures that are being presented in the manifestos. And if we move on to the next slide, that there are certain issues and maybe more kind of long-term perspectives in terms of what can be done, what Wales can't do at the moment, and maybe, because devolution has been described as a process, not an event. So anybody who actually signs up to the concept of devolution has to sign up to the idea that it's not a static thing, it's an evolving, and it will continue to change. And in other words, devolution has to be embraced by the political parties. And so that means that there potentially has to be more constitutional change. And there's some areas that Wales simply doesn't have its hands on the lever, so particularly social security. This is in the hands of the Department of Work and Pensions at Westminster. Wales really can't influence the decisions on social security. We could have a constitutional debate. The setup that's created is kind of half-baked to some extent. That things can't be done because there's so many powers that are still within Westminster, particularly in the area of social security in Wales. And although Wales has piloted a basic income for care leavers, that came to an end last year and is currently being evaluated. And this is actually, this is actually quite interesting. And further ideas towards basic income might emerge in the future. Some of the political parties are saying they will pilot a basic income again. So we'll see what happens. So the constitution, it may need to change. More powers may need to be devolved to Wales, particularly over social security. The commissioners, Wales has innovated so much in social policy over the years with Made in Wales policies. Had the first children's commissioner in the world, and it also has an older persons commissioner, future generations commissioner. So these ideas, these commissioners have the ear of government. They can speak directly to the First Minister and to the Welsh Cabinet, and they could use those privileges to be part of the responsibility of the Commissioner to advocate on behalf, particularly perhaps of young people who are facing so much burden of debt, to implement policies such as free rail travel, for example. It's in one of the manifestos, the idea of free rail travel for young people. So that would be kind of innovative. There's a lot of similarity in conclusion between the political parties. That's quite interesting. They all are trying to address the cost of living crisis within the backdrop of a public which is extremely skeptical about any political party prioritizing it. Despite it being top on the public's interest, they don't believe the political parties are really doing enough and able to do enough to address the cost of living crisis currently. And probably the reason why the general election in Wales is on a knife edge, and potentially is because people feel they're paying tax to the peak level, and that's kind of feeding into kind of Reform Party, which is doing really well in Wales, idea of cutting taxation. And on the other hand, people are still very unsatisfied with public services, with the health service, not seeing any benefit coming through since the 2024 general election. And of course, the cost of living crisis, as I said earlier, they believe it's actually going to get worse. So I think that concludes the presentation from Wales.
Diolch, thank you, much appreciated. So we've got the perspective from both Scotland and Wales there on the political dynamics of what voters are thinking are the issues that matter most to them, and we've also had some insight there into the levers which are available.
Have we got a problem with Kezia's connection? In which case, oh, there we go. You're back.
Did you lose my sound there, Nicola?
Right, we did, we lost you, yeah.
Sorry, I was just summarising to say that was a really helpful overview of where the public stand on the issues that matter most closely to them, as well as a great explainer for the respective powers or levers that each administration has to try and address those. I've got a whole bunch of questions in front of me to cover in the next 20 minutes that we've got together. The first one is really just to go back to this issue of what's in the political parties' manifestoes. So I wonder if I could ask you a sort of two-part question each, starting with you, Hefin, if you don't mind. When you look at the manifestos around cost of living, what policies from the respective parties stand out as genuinely new and rising to meet the kind of size of the challenge ahead? And how is the constitution playing out in Wales? Obviously, we understand Plaid Cymru to be a party that advocates for Welsh independence, but are other political parties arguing for more powers? Question of yourself in a second or two, Nicola.
Okay, from my reading of the manifestos, I think largely it's an extension of what we've already had in terms of social policy in Wales. It's extending universal childcare. It's extending free school meals to secondary schools. It's making free bus travel, free rail travel. That's a new idea for young people. I think it's those kind of ideas. Yes, okay, one party is talking about a Welsh version of the child policy that you have in Scotland, the child benefit in Scotland, at a very, very low level. And the right of centre parties, they are addressing the cost of living crisis in terms of cutting taxation, cutting the business rates, taking that taxation burden off the shoulders of people so they can spend it themselves in the shops. So those are the kind of areas. More broadly, it's quite interesting. There's kind of a lot of overlap. You know, even the Conservative Party manifesto in Wales is talking about electrifying railway lines and that kind of thing. You know, so Welsh politics seems to be kind of different in the sense from the UK-wide policy in that sense, that there seems to be more support for more kind of public intervention in policy areas.
And Nicola, in Scotland, how are the parties arguing the constitutional debate here?
Well, they're not really having it. I mean, the constitutional issue is really low key in this election. And just on the back of what Hefin was saying, I think you see very similar things in the Scottish manifestos about spending here and spending there. And what we're not seeing is a sense in which the difficult choices will have to be made. Things will have to be traded off. And we're not having that honest discussion and debate about what those things would be and where the priorities lie. I suppose the one issue that is very pertinent to cost of living that has come up to an extent is around energy. Energy is largely a reserved matter in both Scotland and Wales. And we do see diversity of positioning around energy in Scotland. And there are claims made that if energy was devolved or in the context of Scottish independence, somehow everything would be okay. But I don't really see how, in the sense that if you go back to the Independence Manifest, the Independence Prospectus ahead of the referendum in 2014, the vision was very much of an independent Scotland remaining within the UK energy market and electricity market. Scotland both benefits from and is penalised from by that. It benefits from it in the sense that the massive investments that are taking place into the grid infrastructure, which are absolutely essential for the transition to clean power, they are being those costs are being socialised across the UK, and that will be to the benefit of Scotland, which obviously in population terms is significantly smaller than and would be difficult to bear those costs alone. On the other hand, we know from transmission charging that the generators in Scotland are paying more, and we also know that consumers in Scotland are not reaping the benefits from the massive amounts of renewable generation that is taking place in Scotland. We saw that, Kez, when we were in Shetland, in particular, where in cost of living pressures obviously are not uniform. Everybody feels them, but they feel them in different ways and to different extents. And that's both a sort of social class issue, but it's also one of geography. And you often see costs of living, even in the good times, being significantly higher in rural Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, and that's exactly the places where you're seeing the biggest transformations in terms of renewables. And you're not, so there's a disjuncture there, but it's very difficult for policymakers, particularly within the devolved context, to do anything about that.
Yeah, the same is true in Wales.
Sorry, Hefin, I'm just going to got a few more questions coming in that we'll get in, but feel free to wedge what you were about to say into your next answer in the traditional political fashion. That always works well. I want to ask about the framing of policies, and then also move on to the issue of tax and universalism. Those are recurring themes coming through the questions from our audience. So just hearing you both talk about policies to do with cost of living and reducing the cost of living, like, for example, affordable childcare, I was personally struck how politicians argue these issues is changing. So in the past in Scotland, when we talked about expanding childcare, it was argued as a policy which had huge benefit to young children, that investing in early learning and childcare was a really important thing to do to close the educational attainment gap, for example. And then that argument developed at a later point into one about women's labour market participation, and we needed access to affordable and flexible childcare in order to get more women active in the economy, to grow those tax receipts, which could then be reinvested in public services. So I'm just really struck by, if the argument then moves towards you need to invest in childcare to reduce the cost of living, the nature of the policy that you might implement might change too. I wonder if that rings true for you, Nicola, and how you see where that takes us to in the end.
So I think the way that policy issues are framed is very heavily influenced by the framer. In other words, it's very heavily influenced by the ideological perspective that a politician starts from. And all of these policies can be multiple things at the same time. And I think we have to be mindful of some of the critiques of devolved policies that have given more weight and emphasis to social policy, whether it's childcare or social security, as well, as if these are separate from economic policies or the active labour market participation. It has to be all of these things at the same time. But what I would really like whoever emerges as the next administration to do is think about these policies in the round. So not think about them through the narrow lens of childcare or education, but think about what are the broader impacts that they have and what is the system within which they are embedded. I think we'll have to do that to be able to sort of make some of those tricky choices.
Hefin, another example around the framing, looking at the manifestos that I can see is how we talk about public transport, for example. You've mentioned to us the offer around free rail travel in Wales. We've got proposals for capping bus fares in Scotland, with already over half of bus users not paying anything at all because of concessionary travel. In the past, we might have argued for investment in public transport to tackle climate change, but now it's a cost of living issue. Does that resonate in Wales?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kezia. It is in the manifestos being framed now. For example, childcare, as you mentioned, is being framed in the manifestos as something to use to address the cost of living crisis. Now, it might not necessarily mean it's not none of the other things are as well. Increasing women's role in the labour market. All those areas are relevant as well. However, it's framed, you're absolutely right, it is framed in the manifestos as this now is a policy for addressing the cost of living crisis. It's going to take, pressure off families financially. And likewise with transport as well. I mean, the whole manifesto seemed to be written, not surprisingly, considering that the cost of living crisis is the main issue. And they need to persuade the electorate that they are the best party to address the cost of living crisis. If they can do that, then they can win the election. So they are framing it in terms of, as we were saying in Wales, some of the parties want to see free train travel, so that's something new, and extending free passes on the buses, for example. Investing in public transport is certainly within the manifestos. So yeah, I would agree. It does come across when you read the manifestos. It's now reframed in terms of we can do this now. Maybe that's a good thing. It will drive that kind of thing forward, and maybe it will extend it to older children from 9 months onwards, and also extend free food in schools for maybe secondary schools. So yeah, we see that contextualized in terms of the cost of living crisis.
Let's talk about tax, because I was really struck from your presentation, Hefin, that graph about falling support for using tax powers. I've seen data in the past which, when you ask the public, do you think people should pay more in tax to invest in public services, you get a big thumbs up. And then you ask the second question, do you think you should pay more tax? And it's very much the opposite answer. But just that relationship between tax, universalism, this idea of a social contract that people were perhaps prepared to pay into the system when they got a good quality product out of it, and the sense that if you're finding it harder to get to the GP, if you're worried about the quality of public services more generally, that might be the driving factor around why attitudes to tax are changing in the round.
Yeah, probably. And it has the desire to pay more tax has stayed. It's been there for quite a long time now. It's going back, I think, roughly about certainly the start of the austerity years. So we go back to 2012, the Welfare Reform Act onwards, and the years of austerity when benefits were frozen, etc. So that was that period of austerity that followed the credit crunch crisis 2008, and then we went into COVID. So there's a lot of public sympathy for higher taxation, and obviously the Labour government elected 2024 did so partly on the back of the fact that people wanted to see better public services. Now, if you listen to John Curtis, he kind of explains that that's a very long period of time that people have supported higher taxations and prioritising public services. In the past, that would have come to an end much earlier, and we would have gone back in the kind of pendulum to wanting more tax cuts. Now, the latest poll there from NatSen is kind of saying, that pendulum has now come back again, and people are now shifting back towards having tax cuts. And it can be understood in terms of, people feeling, well, I'm paying too much tax. If I had more money in my pocket, it would help me through the cost of living crisis. I can see how that's happening. And I think it partly, if not totally, but partly explains why the competition in Wales in this election is between Reform, which is putting forward tax cuts in its manifesto, and Plaid Cymru, which is not. And the Labour Party in the middle is saying we will not raise taxation. That's in its manifesto. They've said, although they have the powers, they've never used them, they could raise income tax in Wales. And they said for the next Senedd, they will not raise taxes.
So the tax powers have been used in Scotland, Nicola, and just looking at the slides you've laid out, referencing the Fiscal Commission and that growing gap between what's coming in from those taxes and the cost of policies that we're already committed to, there's a question from our audience here about just how sustainable universal policies are going to be well into the future, and whether you can foresee that debate returning around a more targeted approach alongside those tax powers.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think there certainly doesn't seem to be much willingness to tackle some of those sorts of totemic policies that have been part of the devolution story. And I'm not saying there should be, but I think we need to start to have these debates. I do think it is important when talking about tax to talk about the other side of the equation. Because yes, most people from the sort of middle income upwards are paying more in income tax in Scotland than they are elsewhere, but they are also receiving more in public services. Might not want those, but they, in terms of whether it's, tuition fees for students, or personal care, or whatever the totem, those universal things that have been there. And I think that is harder when the public are less enthusiastic and less positive, significantly less positive than they used to be about their perceptions of how well public services are being run. I think that's when you start to sort of, that social contract can be challenged a bit, perhaps eroded a bit. So I think we will start to see some of those debates coming in, but not necessarily from the parties themselves, but there are debates that will surround them. In terms of taxation in Scotland, so there's an income tax does an awful lot of heavy lifting, and it is more redistributive, but there's a limit to what else can be done there, not least because there aren't actually that many high earners in Scotland, and we know from the behavioural changes and so on that when you increase rates at that highest level, what you actually are able to gain in terms of revenue is much less than arithmetic would suggest. Where the boost in terms of revenues is coming from is through a process called fiscal drag, where as wages grow, more people are entering into higher tax bands, and so paying more tax as a result of that, even when the overall rates themselves don't change. So yeah, I mean, I think we may start to see debates around universalism versus targeted interventions, and to an extent we're seeing that already with things like the Scottish Child Payment is a targeted intervention. I think we're also, though, starting to see debates around taxing wealth rather than income, which is perhaps a new thing, and it will be interesting to see how that goes and how that interacts with what can actually be done in terms of devolved fiscal autonomy.
Just thinking now about market interventions, and if there's a limit to the cash that you can spend, you have other powers at your disposal to try and change how the market charges the individual rather than the state compensates for it. You referenced in your presentation, Nicola, rent controls and this new idea around limiting the price of essential items being a good example. But we've got one question here from our audience about, yes, market interventions, but set against that context of capital budgets in Scotland falling. And I don't know, Heaven, if you can give us a sense of what's happening in Wales in that regard as well, saying, well, look, the one big market intervention that you could introduce would be to build social housing so that fewer people who are on low incomes have to exist in the private rented sector. So if they lived in social housing instead, that would dramatically reduce the cost of living. But it might become harder to build that social housing because capital budgets are falling so dramatically.
Yeah, well, you've got to remember that actually the Welsh government budget is actually going up. Since the Labour government was elected in 2024, Wales has received more money. So, that was a promise of the Labour government coming into power to increase public expenditure, etc. So the health service, etc., have more money, not less. But it's not filtering through. It takes time for policies to, once they're implemented, to affect people's lives, for people to see the benefits, and that's one of the problems that Welsh Labour has. It's run out of time, as it were, to see those kind of changes. And also, I don't think we can underestimate the fact that the Westminster politics is affecting the Welsh election, what's going on in Westminster. And going back to the tax point, I think probably the Labour government's decision, as it were, to postpone welfare reform has played into this to some extent. I wouldn't exaggerate it, but it's there. The fact that they plan to do the kind of changes to the PIP and other benefits, etc., and then they U-turned, and then people that then have this kind of sense, rightly or wrongly, that benefits are going up and all that kind of stuff, and of course they have gone up. So that's the reason why I think there's a kind of shift towards more tax cuts, and that might play into the hands in this election to some extent to parties like Reform. And so that's partly the problem, I think, in Wales, that the budget is going up, but it's not filtering through. People are not seeing their quality of life improving, and they're very bleak about the future. They think it's going to get worse. So in terms, I agree though your second point there about regulation. We see that in the manifestoes. We see things like having new regulators for water, for example, which is in a complete mess in Wales. Polluted rivers, seas, etc. So there's going to be more regulation on that kind of thing. So and also on pricing as well, particularly bus passes. We already mentioned free bus passes for the over 60s is remaining. Nobody's planning on taking that away.
Nicole, final word to you.
So on housing, housing is often the poor relation in public policy terms to other areas that perhaps capture a broader section of the electorate, the NHS in particular, education and so on. And I think it would be enormously helpful if we could, so in terms of capital budgets, your point about investment, there is a limit to what can be done because of the budget. Choices have to be made, and that will be a matter of political judgment. But housing is so critical to public health. It's so critical to well-being. It's so critical to how well a child will do in school. So I think thinking of these issues not just as siloed housing issues or education issues or health issues to be competed against each other in this difficult climate, what I would really love the next administration to do is be realistic about what can be achieved in 5 years, set the priorities, and figure out how to systemically get there by looking at the whole range of levers at their disposal.
And actually seeking to break down those barriers between policy silos is exactly what we spend our days doing at the Centre for Public Policy. So people should take a look. People should take a look at our website for more details in that regard. I'm afraid that's all the time that we've got for questions today, folks. So a huge thanks to Professor Nicola McEwen and to Dr. Hefin Gwillan for their insights and expertise today. All that's left to say in the time that we've got left together is a further chance to advertise the forthcoming webinars here at the Centre for Public Policy. If you enjoyed today, please join us again on Monday. You can do that by scanning this QR code, which will take you to details of all the webinars that we've got coming up. But on Monday at 1:30, we're hosting a webinar alongside the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And you may have noticed that they've been producing analysis looking at whether or not party manifestos add up financially as each of those manifestos have been published. To hear the results in the round and what that might mean for the next Scottish Government, you can join us at 1:30 on Monday, and the details how to do that are on your screen then. And then also next Thursday, we've got a joint webinar with FAcSS looking at yes polling and what the latest polling is telling us about voting intentions in Scotland, but also what's driving those voting intentions, what underpins, for example, that rise in reform vote, what's happened to the Labour vote, where is it going? All those issues will be covered in detail with FAcSS on Thursday. Thanks so much for signing up to watch today. Please continue to follow us. You can do so on Blue Sky and on LinkedIn, and indeed by following our Spotlight podcast. Thanks and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye for now.